course, this never comes really into focus as Rawls limits himself to speak about already existing states and only justice within these states and not between nations or between states, as would be the case if we're talking about forcefully included nations or ethnic groups. So the second assumption is that a society governed by the principles of justice provides equal access to the social basis of self-respect. However, the experiences of historic injustice can leave the former victims and even later generations of this group in a position where they have less access to the social basis of self-respect, even if the current society is a basically just one. So there are several reasons for that, and I will quickly review some of them with regards to the three sources of self-respect mentioned before. Firstly, grave historic injustice are often aimed at dissolving the groups that would normally share the same conception of the good and therefore could offer support and appreciation of life plans and conceptions of the good of the individual. So even if such any assimilationist or genocidal policies have ceased, you still have lasting effects that prevent members of these groups to have access to such a group that all other citizens or your average citizen would have. So these cultural groups normally it's often cultural groups that are subject to these kind of historic injustice. So these cultural groups are often traumatized or dispersed or in any other way not able to create a healthy and supportive environment for their members. So these members of such groups are in a disadvantaged position compared to other citizens whose peer or cultural group never has suffered such historic injustice. Secondly, Spinner-Half's concept of enduring injustice draws attention to the fact that formerly persecuted, oppressed, colonized, or marginalized groups are still suffering long-term consequences of past injustices, even if they are not actively committed anymore. This means that such groups are more likely than others to occupy worse economic positions or be actually the group who are the worst off in a Rawlsian society, because Rawls does not advocate an egalitarian society, so there always are some differences in positions. And this goes hand in hand with less opportunities to pursue one's own life's plans effectively. So it's often that exactly those groups who have experienced historic injustice are now experiencing that they have less opportunities because of these enduring injustice or effects that these injustices have even generations later in a now just or otherwise just society. So the third and maybe most important point is that members of groups that experience severe historic injustice often have less access to the social basis of self-respect because their status equality is not secure. One of the defining parts of colonialism and other forms of oppression was the continued denial of status equality and equal citizenship, which originated in distinct ideologies of supremacy, for example. So Sparrow, talking about Australia, points out that even though many settler states now formally recognize everyone as equal, they never really convincingly broke with their past. So he says, for example, until recently there were very few sincere public apologies for historic injustices. The same political institutions and systems that were once used to justify colonialism and implemented such policies are still in power and are still governing those groups that they were formerly oppressing. Restitution and compensation is often just reluctantly offered, or there are fights about that. Or many current policies, though using different justifications for what they do, have shockingly similar effects and outcomes to colonial practices from the past. So in light of this, Timothy Walliger, for example, I think rightly argues that there is good reason for groups who were affected by historic injustice to mistrust the official vows that they are regarded and treated as equals not only now but also in the future. In order to truly feel as equals, they might need stronger assurances about their status than the average citizen. unless these assurances are given, these people might be in a permanent state of subjectively, but justifiably, felt insecurity or threat and inferiority to the other citizens in that state. Both conditions of feeling threatened by the state or by the state institutions and feeling that they are still regarded as inferior in some cases heavily undermine self-respect. So putting them in a disadvantaged position again when it comes to access to the social basis of self-respect, which is heavily fueled by openly admitted status equality of everyone. So what are the implications of this? I argue that these discrepancies between Rawls's theory or ideal theory assumptions and the actual situation of indigenous peoples give rise to some remedial rights. Remedial because they aim at rectifying the non-ideal circumstances created by historic injustice and will cease to be justifiable, but also relevant once the imperfections are removed and ideal theory can be applied. So, as Rawls is only concerned with justice within a state and not with justice between potential states and nations, I can only guess what his response to forcefully included citizens would be, but it seems at least not too unlikely that he would accept that these unwilling parties constitute their own state, that is, to exercise the right to self-determination. But that's just like one possibility, so the argument doesn't really hinge on that guess. What is a much stronger argument in favor of indigenous rights is the concern for the social basis of self-respect. And here it is also much clearer what an answer within the Rawlsian framework would be. Rawls proclaims self-respect as the most important primary good, and he constructs his principles of justice in such a way that they protect the social basis of self-respect. For example, the lexical priority of liberties and their egalitarian distribution is primarily justified by the role liberties play in protecting actual and symbolic status equality, in allowing peer groups to form, and in protecting the foundations and providing the foundations for forming and pursuing one's life, plans and conceptions of the good. So if concern for self-respect is structuring Rawls's theory in such a way, it seems likely that Rawls would prioritize equalizing access to the social basis of self-respect over almost any other justice concerns. In the case of indigenous peoples, almost granting land rights and the right to self-determination, that is the main claims of indigenous people, seem to possess both symbolic and practical importance in equalizing this access to the social basis of self-respect. On the one hand, they offer assurance and empower indigenous peoples in a way that they will not be subjected again to the same or maybe slightly different injustices as they were in the past. So in that sense, they offer some self-protection in the way we also see self-determination. Furthermore, they signify a clear break with history and with the past, as Barrow, for example, criticizes that it has not been done yet. The denial or land grabbing and the denial of self-determination rights lie at the heart of many colonial practices. So on the one hand, they are what has caused a lot of harm to indigenous people in a very practical way by denying them the space to live or denying them the opportunity to practice their culture or their way of living. But it's also symbolic of a certain ideology that was driving colonialism. So restituting, or probably not all of it, but part of these rights would both symbolize the overcoming not only the colonial way of acting, but also the colonial way of thinking in a very powerful way, and would make the public apologies for this historic injustice and the assurances that this will never happen again much more sincere and believable. So granting these rights to indigenous people therefore plays a crucial part in creating conditions in which they have the same access to the social basis of self-respect as other citizens, at least at the today, where they still need, or they might still need these reassurances, and are claiming these rights as part of that also. So I'll now turn to the last, to the third of Rawls' assumption, namely that income and wealth can function as the main criteria for measuring who is worse off and how and which position within society has gotten better or worse. So for Rawls, the difference principle is supposed to be applicable both to economic and social inequalities. But what he's actually doing is that he's saying those can both be measured in terms of wealth and income, and they serve as a proxy. So other social inequalities that mark, or other social goods that mark social inequality, like health or education, social status, etc., are normally the better or the worse, the more income, for example, you have. It's very unlikely that you have poor access to health services if you're very rich, for example. So he kind of accepts that as the one criteria we should look at, even though he's also, of course, talking about education and equal access to education. And he sometimes makes the claim, for example, that employment is another important factor, both with regard to self-respect and to social inequality, because it provides people with a sense of self-respect, and it gives their life some sense, and there might be part of their life plans. However, one thing he's not really talking about, but which, for example, figures prominently in Kumlika's work, is access to one's own culture. And I think that's also important in terms of being a primary good and a social good that marks inequality and social inequality. So if we include access to one's own culture into this criteria for how good or how bad a position of a certain group is within a society, the picture often changes in favor of Indigenous rights. Because for Indigenous peoples, the right to exercise and have access to their own culture is often directly connected to land rights and the right to self-determination. For land rights, the fact is that many Indigenous people have close cultural ties with land rights, but also spiritual ties. So they, in order to access or to exercise their religion, they often need access or want access to certain significant places or landmarks. They have historical significance for them, and also they're important with respect to their way of life, that they say, for example, they need or a certain environmental places should be protected, or they want to have fishing rights or herding rights, etc. So that's a connection of land rights with or access to the right to access to culture. Moreover, some groups argue that their way of life and the conception of the good is so fundamentally different from that of the majority that they can only practice and sustain it if they are autonomous. So they're saying that their economic system, for example, their cultural system, is so much at odds with the current political or economic or cultural system of the state they're living in, that they will never really be able to practice their culture, their way of life, as long as they're subject to the laws and the system of the state, and therefore they need self-determination. Thus, if all of that is correct, or if we accept there's at least some cases where these arguments are valid, then broadening the catalogue of criteria with which to measure social inequality might strengthen Indigenous rights. If we only look at income and wealth, it might be very well justified, for example, to extract resources on ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples, even against their will. That is, given that the economic gains are distributed in a way that benefits them materially. poorest, and materially is the key word here. So, yet if access to culture is taken into account, the picture often changes, so that resource extraction, for example, might put indigenous peoples in such a bad position with regard to culture that their land rights might prevail, because everything taken into account, we could say there are, if we just look at income and wealth, there might be another group that is worse off than indigenous people, so they would be elevated by resource extraction. But if we destroy culture, indigenous people or the group of with that culture might drop so low that they are even below where the worst off group before them was. So yeah, so all in all, I think there are two kinds of argument one can make in favor of indigenous rights within Rawls' theory. The first was the remedial rights approach, where it's mostly about rectifying the effects of historic injustice. So the strongest argument here was the concern for the social basis of self-respect. But of course, even though this might be the strongest argument, it's only a temporal argument in some ways. In some ways because maybe at one point indigenous people recover in a way that they would have the normal access to social basis of self-respect as the average citizen. They wouldn't need any preferential treatment or any reassurances. Of course, on the other hand, still some permanent rights might flow out of it, because if you're saying, well, we accept you've got this, your self-respect is kind of undermined by this historic injustice and the insecurity you still feel about it, so we're giving you the land rights now, or your self-determination rights now. But once you've overcome that kind of historical trauma, we're taking them back. That's of course not working. So these rights this might be only working if you grant permanent rights. And the second route one could take is the one about to talk about revising parts of Rawls' theory in a way that we're not saying he's wrong, but just broadening what he's taking into account when he's talking about the difference principle and social inequalities, and including access to culture in these deliberations, which then, of course, leads in a way to more permanent rights, that these this would be a permanent change in the way we think about the distribution of rights and who's the worst off and things like that. But it, of course, is not such a strong, or doesn't give birth to such strong rights, because they always are in competition with other criteria figuring into social and economic inequality. So they must always be weighed against others. Yeah, so
thank you.
Thank you.